see
Our panelists join us here to decode what's been transpiring. Ajay Dua, former Commerce Secretary, is also joining us. Saket Mishra and PK Basu are continuing with us as well. Ajay Dua, I want to ask you this. Why is it that Donald Trump thinks he can bulldoze India the way he's doing it? I mean, what explains this 50% tariff that's been levied on India?
I think it is his concern or his conviction that India wants to badly enter into a bilateral trade agreement with the US, and that thinking that the additional tariffs India would accept in the expectation that when the BTA is signed, whether it's this month or a month or two later, all these would be removed, and India would have given without really compromising on one or two concessions on agriculture, which he might then make, that India would accept the situation. I think his reading is that India wants the US in
I believe we've encountered some audio issue there with you, Ajay Dua. We'll try and reconnect that and get a better line with you. But PK Basu, I want to ask you this. You know, the art of making a deal was something that Donald Trump was often spoken of. From the deal maker to a tantrum thrower, is that what he's become?
Yes, I think this is what he considers the art of the deal. Throw tantrums, shout from the rooftops, and there's something called TACO. Trump always
chickens out.
Right? So, these are threats. But I think the important thing to understand is that what he is saying in today's tweet and today's executive order is that India will face these tariffs 21 days from today. That is from noon Eastern US time on the 27th of August. A US delegation is coming to India on the 25th of August. So this is not the end of the matter. It's not as if he has imposed this with effect from today. He has imposed this with at least a 21-day warning. Plus, there are certain provisions that only come into effect almost a month later, around 17th or 27th of September. So it is not immediate. I think your coverage should emphasize this point, that it's not immediate. It is still a negotiating ploy. It is very much what Trump considers to be the art of the deal, where he threatens and shouts from the rooftop. I don't think his methods are working that well with India. But I think it's also important to understand that our negotiators thought we were very close to a deal. Trump himself was tweeting until 3 or 4 weeks ago that that we're about to have a deal with India. We're very close, etc.
Correct.
But something has, some bee in his bonnet has gone off, and that seems to be Russian oil. Today, his envoy to Russia, Steve Witkoff, met Putin, and presumably that meeting didn't go very well, or at least didn't go as well as Trump expected. And so he is going bonkers with this. Now, the simple fact is, I think Putin realizes, and we should realize, that Trump cannot afford oil prices to zoom up. If there is a complete ban on imports of Russian oil, that will be disastrous. For oil prices will go up sharply.
Absolutely.
And that will destroy Trump's agenda. So he cannot afford to push oil prices up. I think Putin recognizes this. We should recognize it as well.
And that was one of the reasons why the United States wanted us to buy Russian oil in the first place.
Our other exports.
US nudged us to buy Russian oil just last year or a year before that because they didn't want the prices to go up. We'll try and reconnect that line with PK Basu. Ajay Dua, I believe you're back, and I saw your hand going up. But I'll just come to you in a moment. Saket Mishra, I ask you to wait with us as well. Zaka Jacob, managing editor, joining us, getting us more perspective on this. Zaka, how do you read this? The highest in Asia, only on par with Brazil around the world. What exactly is on Trump's mind?
Look, I think one thing that it and internal affairs over the last few days. So it's 25% plus 25%. But there's one thing in the fine print which I thought was interesting, was that this new order, the 25% extra Russian oil, will come into effect 21 days from now. So today is the 6th of August. It'll effectively come into effect from the 27th of August, which means there's another 3 weeks for negotiators on both sides to try and see if they can arrive at some kind of a middle ground which is satisfactory to both parties, at least as far as the Russian oil import part is concerned. So it is also, in effect, the 21 days, what it also means is that the US negotiating team, which is next expected to be in New Delhi, I think in the last week of August, if I'm not mistaken, on the 25th, it allows them to try and have one last shot at whether they can actually negotiate and bargain and arrive at some kind of a concession, if not on the entire 50%, but certainly on the import of Russian oil part. Also, a lot can change between now and the end of the month, because the war itself, we're given to understand, is at a tricky situation. And if we know that Witkoff has met with Putin earlier today, Mr. Doval will be meeting with senior Russian officials, including, we're told, President Putin tomorrow. If some kind of an agreement can be arrived at there, because look, ultimately what Trump wants is for India to stop buying Russian oil. India's made it clear that India is going to buy from whoever India perceives is in its national interest. In this case, from Russia, because Russia was offering oil at a cheaper rate compared to Saudi Arabian oil or other Middle Eastern oil, or even US oil. I think what now is the
Zaka, will try and reconnect that line with you. It seems to be sketchy. Zaka there is in Israel and Tel Aviv, but our panelists continue to be with us. Ajay Dua, you were making a point before we got cut off. If you could, complete that thought of yours and talk about how India should be dealing with this now, because India so far has stood its ground.
I think we need to divide, as Zaka very rightly said said a few moments ago, that the 25% additional penalty doesn't kick in till the 27th of this month. And on the 25th, we have the next round of negotiations in Delhi. Washington has not said that it's not going to send its team, nor have we said that we would not welcome it. We are ready. We might have, in the light of what's been happening and the imposition of the basic the basic duty going up from 10% to 25%, we might also dilute our stand. And I think what we have done, the UK should now be really a platform to kind of a basis for us to talk to the US. Our trade with the US much more than with the UK. So if we could make several concessions to the United Kingdom in the hope that things would improve, we will develop our trade with it also in a few years. I think a flexibility during the BTA negotiations would help, and that might appease the US and to come down to see there. What was going around was that till all this started about a week ago, that we are close to signing a deal with the US, and the US has agreed to a few things, and only agriculture, dairying, and the GMO issue, the genetic modified
crops, yes.
Yeah, that remained. But now, with the 25%, we should not try and reopen the issues. Let the US say that they're not backing out of whatever it has been agreed to earlier. And we are keen to have a deal, let that be conveyed to it, because it will settle matters for permanently or till during the currency of the BTA, because the length tenure can be to it also. That's number one. Number two, I think on the petroleum issue, crude oil issue, the double face stand or double standards by the US are increasingly getting exposed. It is not merely the US. After you recall, Eric Garcetti, who was the US ambassador to India, had openly admitted that I had nudged the US to go along, US to go along with Indian buying of oil from crude oil from there. Then Janet Yellen, this US Treasury Secretary, had gone on record saying as long as the US is not, India is not using the G7 institutions of banking and shipping, we have no problem because it brings more petrol into the market.
Correct.
And finally, it was admitted by Jeffrey, who I think that was his name, who admitted saying that India has brought about a stability in the market. And the US issued letting in it because they had put a cap saying any crude oil bought below a particular level is okay.
Yes.
That was to force the Russians to give a higher discount. So
And which we
with
stuck to.
this
So we were in
kind
no
of a thing
violation
going
of
on,
we were
and
in no
on top of
violation
it,
of any
they
of the
themselves-
norms that were put in place by the United States. But it suddenly seems that Donald Trump has decided that the rules change because it's convenient to me now. But do stay on with us, Ajay Dua. William Butler, economist and former global chief economist at the Citigroup, is also with us. But Saket Mishra, you've been patiently waiting, and I want to ask you this. You know, so far the kind of threats that were being made by Donald Trump, the warnings that, if you would call them that he'd been issuing to India, the kind of sentiment in the markets here, we sort of shrugged them off. There was very little impact, so to say. What do you think is going to look like tomorrow, 9:30 a.m.?
I mean, look, I think we may have a small correction in the market, but it will even out soon enough because in reality, the impact on our GDP is fairly marginal. And the reality is that India is too big an economy now to get taken in by these threats. It is also very clear, and I mean, I sort of disagree with your correspondent in the US. Negotiations always happen. Even when officially there are no negotiations, there's a whole track, and India and the US have so many strategic dialogues going out that negotiations will happen. To my mind, this entire exercise is very Trumpian. One, past commitments made by other US governments, he almost thrives in breaking them. Second, it's a negotiating tactic. He knows that there is a democracy in India, and the moment he threatens to put tariff, there'll be a clamor for, oh, we need to have a presidential address and we need to have a prime minister talking. When the fact is, the only talking that needs to be done is between the negotiators on the 25th of August and before that by the phone. And I'm sure that's going to be happening. So I think the markets may correct a little bit. But again, the markets have understood. After all, China had 140% plus tariffs announced. And then it was delayed by 30 days and 60 days, etc., etc. So I'm reasonably certain that the market, as well as the strategic strength of the US-India relationship, will lead to a good solution. We may see a correction, maybe an interesting opportunity to buy. I don't want to make any recommendations, but I don't see that as any huge issue.
So we will see some maybe ebb and flow, but it's not going to be a big deal, or not as much as definitely what Trump thinks it would be. Joining us also on this broadcast is Republican strategist David Sofair. Thank you so much for speaking with us here on Brass Tacks, David. How do you read what's been happening with the US president? I mean, up until a couple of weeks ago, he was saying that we're very close to getting a deal, that India and the United States are great friends. I'm great friends with the Prime Minister personally. Turn around, and then we have the US president saying that, oh, India is not a good trading partner and penalties will be levied. And he's made good on that threat today.
Sure. Well, I think well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. And first of all, I think it's come to it's a big surprise that India has decided to buy the Russian oil. So moving forward, we are going to negotiate now with the tariffs, and the discussions are ongoing. So, that is going to be a key focus of the administration, how we can make trade fair again. Because what you have to understand is we are actively and aggressively pursuing the American Fair Trade Initiative. So we are cleaning up a lot of, the unfair tariffs that were levied against us. And, we're not going to put up with unfair trade and anti-American and, practices. So this is a very good example of that, So hopefully I really see this as being cleaned up and a resolution happening soon, when it comes to Russian oil and fair trade and, fair reciprocal tariffs.
But what
So that's
about
kind of
what
where we are.
about all the imports that go in from Russia to the United States? What about to the European Union? The United States has cracked a deal with the European Union.
So the European Union is, they have not, they continue to buy Russian oil at an alarming rate. I mean, if you look at Germany, they're, the huge trading partner with the Russians, and they have not ceased or desisted for any of that. So, America is not, trading big with Russia, and I think that those contracts, we've not seen them. I think a lot of what you're saying on the panel is unfounded and speculative in regards to American trade with Russia. So, we are actively trying to seek out energy independence, and we are seeking out fair trade. So hopefully, our friends in India, and our friends, are one of our closest allies, will be able to come to an amicable solution with this unfortunate, large Russian energy purchase.
You say we're in allies, both India and the United States, but many would suggest that that doesn't seem to be the sentiment, at least that's coming out of the White House at the moment. But do stay on with us. William Butler also joining us on this broadcast. How do you read this 50% tariff that has been levied by the United States on India? Some would say this is, Donald Trump's frustration with Vladimir Putin, because when he came to power, he said, I will end the Ukraine war in 100 days. That's far from happening. Is that sort of frustration with Putin now spilling over onto India?
I think that's certainly part of the story. The growing hostility of Trump towards Putin and Russia leads him to do things like imposing 25% extra tariff on India that he would not have considered on April the 2nd, when he started his tariff war. But the underlying trade issues with India are non-trivial either. The US does consider India, I think correctly, to be a high tariff country, and it would like to see some of the tariffs on its product exported to India to get lower tariffs. And remember, in the bargaining game, India is not, at the moment, a major partner of the US. 2.3% of US exports goes to India, 2.7% of US imports comes from India. Clearly, in a normally functioning world, this would increase very rapidly, since India is the most rapidly growing large nation in the world. But at the moment, the trade interaction from an American perspective is minor. So they can afford to bluff and to throw out these ridiculous numbers of 50% tariffs, which would be trade terminating if they persisted. But I think this is just part of a bargaining game which will require India to make concessions on its oil imports from Russia, and possibly also its purchases of military equipment from Russia, and will also require some reduction in Indian tariffs on imports from the United States. These two are necessary, but talks will continue and are continuing. This is not the end of the story.
PK Basu, do you agree with that assessment that yes, it's not the end of the story, and perhaps that's why Donald Trump has chosen that 21-day period to for these tariffs to come into effect, because before that the US negotiating team would be here. But is this just a pressure tactic? I mean, unless India gives in to all that the United States is demanding, is there no way out of this?
It is certainly a pressure tactic, as I said previously. There's a 21-day deadline before these new tariffs come into effect. But the simple fact is that if the US is serious about banning all countries from importing Russian oil, then that will sharply increase global oil prices. And that is certainly to the detriment of the US in particular. The only reason why US inflation is low is because oil prices have been low ever since the US election, because Trump announced that he would be sharply increasing US supplies of oil and gas, and encouraged OPEC Plus, which includes Russia, to increase its production as well. So if you take Russian oil out, Russia is the world's second biggest producer of oil and second largest exporter of oil. So if you take Russian oil out of the global market, that will cause a huge spike in global crude oil prices. And that is not an outcome that is to the benefit of the United States, given the fact that Trump has promised his voters that he is going to keep inflation in check. So far, inflation in the US, core inflation as well as headline inflation, has been lower during the Trump presidency than most people expected, and lower than during the Biden administration. But that'll go out of the window if there is a complete ban on any country importing oil from Russia. So it is a threat. It is part of the negotiation. And the US delegation is going to be in India on the 25th. Can we play chicken with the US, or will Trump always chicken out? That is yet to be seen.
And those days are not far away, but Charles Kupchan, international affairs expert, also joins us. He's a senior fellow at CFR as well. Charles, how do you read what's transpired and the assessment that we've been making during this particular discussion? You know, is this something that could backfire on the Trump administration, the kind of tariff warpath that he seems to be on with India?
Well, I'm guessing that what's happened here is that Witkoff's conversation with Putin today in Moscow produced no breakthrough. President Trump therefore felt that he needed to deliver on his pledge to increase the pressure on Russia, and on his pledge to add to the 25% initial tariff on India a so-called penalty because of India's imports of Russian oil. Is this part of a new strategy in which Trump is actually going to impose high tariffs on any country that buys Russian energy, including China? I don't know. It's very difficult to tell what their strategy here is. I agree with the speaker, Mr. Basu, who said that this will spike global oil prices. It will. And we're already looking at tariffs on just about every trading partner of the United States, which will cause significant increases in the cost of daily life here in the United States, including for Trump's base. In many respects, they're going to be the hardest hit. So I understand why Trump is trying to tighten the screws on Russia, right? He needs to apply more coercive pressure on Putin if he's going to convince Putin to stop bombing and attacking Ukraine. But I'm skeptical that this strategy of trying to strangle the Russian economy is going to work. I think mainly it will take more U.S. weapons to stop Putin. And I'm puzzled as to why Trump seems to be singling out India for this punishment, as opposed to China, which buys lots and lots of Russian oil and gas and has been key in supporting the war and trading items, including electronic items that Russians are using to repurpose for military weapons and systems. So we'll have to see where this goes.
So David Sofair, why this leeway for China, this 90-day grace period as negotiations are going on? And even while that's going on, the tariff rate that has been imposed is just at 30%, far lower than India. So why that leeway for China, which one would think that perhaps is the biggest competition that the United States and the Trump administration would want to fight?
You know, it's 50% today, and it can be 15% tomorrow. So we are actively negotiating with our friends in India at this time. And, we really have to see where this goes. And it has a lot to do with Chinese supply chain as well. So, we have a big trading partnership with China, unfortunately, and are reliant on many of the goods in the American supply chain. To your guest's point as well, America is actually in inflation is going a lot lower in the States thanks to Trump's fantastic initiatives with the economy. He's really taking a hold on there. Also, America is about to release a plethora of oil and petrol onto the market. So that will really reduce price and as American production increases. So I don't see this being a long-term thing. So there's not been a huge rise in crude oil as a result of this, in this tariff. And everyday Americans are getting a lot of relief at the pumps, when it comes to petrol and oil and food prices. So that's been a good thing. So, we're making America fair again. And remember, it's the American Free Trade Initiative and Fair Trade Initiative. And if tariffs are so bad, why does every other country have one against the United States? So we're actively, aggressively making life better for everyday Americans.
Is that the case, William Butler? Would you agree that every day is getting better for Americans? Because, economy or the handling of it or the mishandling of it was something that Donald Trump spoke ever so often against the Democrats in the run-up to his election campaign. And once he was president, he now seems to be on this path where this could completely backfire for him and the economy.
The American economic situation is very mixed. Inflation is still above target. It seems to be stabilizing rather than coming down further. And there are some signs of real economic weakness, although nothing significant yet. But the main thing is that the American Free and Fair Trade Initiative is neither free nor fair. Right? It's imposing tariffs across the world in the hope of negotiating better trade deals, investment deals, military equipment purchase deals, and all that. The effect of India stopping oil imports from Russia on oil prices should not be overestimated. First of all, the US itself, as the previous speaker pointed out, can increase its production significantly, and then Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait can increase the supply at short notice in large quantities. So this is not a showstopper. I think then, and it is part now of the American strategy of increasing pressure on Putin. It will be done presumably by a combination of higher tariffs on countries importing oil from Russia, and also increased sales of key military equipment to the Ukraine, most likely through the EU, the way these recent purchases have been financed.
So those negotiations will be on. The pressure will be felt by the United States and its economy as well, perhaps. But Saket Mishra, if this is a pressure tactic and if this is one way of getting India to give in to some of the demands that the United States is making, what, in your opinion, could those leeways be? What are the concessions that India can make? Because there is a lot that India needs to think about, especially as far as the agriculture sector goes, because small and marginal farmers here in India will not be able to compete if we give the United States the kind of access they want.
Look, I think a lot of things are open for discussion right now, except perhaps dairy and agricultural produce, and I'm sure there's a bit more give and take on a lot of other things. I mean, including, for example, automotives, etc., where there may be scope for India and the United States to work better together. I do not think India is going to play a game of chicken with anybody. And I do want to point out that when our External Affairs Minister has spoken about particular data, I think that data, in fact, in many cases, comes from the United States. So I'm not sure it's, that it's created out of thin air. It's real data. But the process of negotiation involves everybody trying to do their best and trying to use all the pressure points that they can. So it's par for the course. I'm sure we will. I'm reasonably certain that we will reach a fair solution. It may have a few roadblocks, but I think we'll get there. And India does not, by any measure, need to suddenly bow down or give up on things. And as far as China is concerned, I do want to make the point. There's a very clear reason why China has been given greater leeway, because if China suddenly starts having tariffs, they provide some massive percentage of input goods. I mean, forget the rare earth metals, but also input goods in multiple industries in the United States. And therefore, it's not as if they can be wished away. And same thing happens for the world trade. I don't think world trade can be wished away because countries are interlinked, and I'm sure we'll reach a good solution.
And hopefully that solution does come in soon. But Charles Kupchan, until that does, where do we go forward from here? Because also this is a relationship between the two countries. It's not about Donald Trump and another individual here or the negotiating teams. It is about two countries. Is Donald Trump jeopardizing that particular relationship between the two countries for what one would say is his political convenience?
I would agree with what Saket just said, that the reason that Trump is going after India in particular is in part because the economic stakes are lower. And if the United States gets into a trade war with China and China stops exporting rare earths to the United States, that shuts down the supply chain for cars and for other industries that need those. And also the impact on global trade, if he were to hit China with 50, 60+% would be huge, and the impact on the American consumer would be huge. But I generally agree with your point that the United States and India have made remarkable progress over the last 10 years or so in improving their relationship on all kinds of different fronts, but in particular on the broad geopolitical strategic relationship, the Quad, the effort to balance against the rise of China, the investment in co-production and technology. A lot of progress here. And I do think that these tariffs are going to put a damper on the relationship. They're going to hurt the relationship at a time when we need a stronger U.S.-India bilateral dialogue and relationship. So let's hope that in these negotiations, we are going to make some progress. We're going to get a trade deal that lower these tariffs. And I'm waiting to see whether Trump takes the next step. That is to say, to slap high tariffs on anybody who buys Russian oil. Because if he doesn't do that, this strategy is not going to work.
This strategy will definitely not work, but what will work, Ajay Dua, as far as the negotiations go? Because like I said, there are certain leeways that India has refused to make. Those concessions are where that red line has been drawn by New Delhi. And the United States keeps pushing with pressure tactics like this. But where does India go from here? What is the next step between the two countries and between, in the sense that, are we any closer to getting that deal? Because this was supposed to be sort of a limited deal. The larger bilateral deal was supposed to happen much later in the year.
You're very right, but the way things have gone, particularly during the last fortnight, does make it rather clear to our negotiating team and our government that President Trump, because the chief negotiator in the US is just one man, that's President Trump, that he needs to be shown some flexibility on what we are calling the red flags for us or the red lines. And in that, I think while we protect our food industry, a bit of concession in horticulture products. See, we have done that in case of apples. We've done that in case of whiskey for the UK. Those kind of things which are not really consumed by the average man, by the common man in the street, could perhaps be considered, whether whichever other fruits are there, they're talking of cashew nuts and other things, walnuts, etc. That's one issue which I think we should look at. Second, we made a concession on IPRs. In the case of UK, yes, we had made a IPR Act in 2003, which was in line with what the WTO's TRIPS requirement was, but there have been lots of kind of objections from the US that Indian government wanted to check the evergreening of patents, particularly in drugs and pharmaceutical, it has made it extremely difficult for the US companies and the other Western drug pharmaceutical companies. But at the same time, the enforcement of IPRs in India is very poor. So we would need to reckon with the fact that we do have, on one side, a degree of weakness. Our IPR, we do not have a separate enforcement agency. The SH police station even looks after patents, the offenses, and if there are murders and other more serious crimes, he has very little time to investigate the IPR complaints which get lodged before him. So
Right.
somewhere we'll have to compromise there, but keeping our national interest in mind totally, and let the national interest be, I would say, a little bit long term, not just the immediate, because we must admit that the productivity of our agriculture is rather low. Productivity per person, productivity per acre of land, and productivity per unit of capital which we
Sure.
apply. So, which area of agriculture would
Sure, but India has taken a stance as far as the agriculture and dairy sectors are concerned. I thank you all, gentlemen, in fact, for joining us here on this edition of Brass Tacks, because this our rolling coverage here continues. And in fact, the Ministry of External Affairs in India here has responded to this 50% tariff that has just come to the fore. And this is the statement that we have with us, where New Delhi has called out what it says is unfair and unjustified imports, tariffs that have been levied by the United States. India has made it clear that we've already cleared our position on those issues as far as buying Russian oil is concerned, including the fact that our imports are based on market factors and done with the overall objective of ensuring energy security of 1.4 billion people of India. It is extremely unfortunate, says New Delhi, that US should choose to impose these additional tariffs for actions that several other countries are taking in their own national interest. This is a stance that India has been taking. This was the statement that was made when 25% was levied on India. And now, as we see that being doubled by the United States, New Delhi making it very clear that these actions by President Trump are completely unfair. Siddhant, my colleague, now joins us, getting us more perspective on this. Siddhant, once again, United States there being called out by India, making it very clear that what India is being penalized for is being done by many other countries.
Well, that's right, Poonam. In fact, for a very long time, India has maintained a very measured response when it comes to President Trump's commentary, his administration's commentary. But this is the third statement in line. In fact, the first statement came from the Commerce Ministry, then Ministry of External Affairs day before yesterday. Now, again, they have issued a statement on the fresh tariff, 25% tariff that has been imposed by President Trump. Now, India says that it is extremely unfortunate that the U.S. should choose to impose additional tariffs on India for actions that several other countries are also taking in their own national interest. Now, Poonam, we have a report of international agencies, and perhaps that report says not only India, but South Korea, Taiwan, Turkey, Japan, they all have been, importing, petroleum products, crude, LNG, etc. from Russia.
Yes.
Now, Minister of External Affairs also say that we reiterate that these actions are unfair, unjustified and unreasonable. India will take all actions necessary to protect its national interests. So,
that stance has been made very clear by New Delhi that we will respond if it comes to that, and these kind of pressure tactics and threats will not work with us. Siddhant, thank you so much for joining us and getting us the latest on that front as we bring our viewers up to speed with the new statement that has come to the fore from the Ministry of External Affairs, making it very clear that India's interests will be kept paramount and there is going to be no compromise on that. But to dig a little deeper into what this means and where we head from here, joining us on this broadcast is also Mark Linscott. He's a senior advisor with the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. Thank you so much, Mr. Linscott, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18 on Brass Tacks. And I want to begin by asking you this,